The next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit more detail on data extraction and how the data extraction 1.0 is customizable, even if it's not in the most intuitive way, which is one of the more common pieces of feedback we get. So right now what I'm looking at is the extraction 1.0 form on a study that I have already set up in one of my reviews. So I have my study PDF here on the left, and I have my data extraction form on the right. As I was saying in the introduction, this is very much a pre-formatted form. So all of these data points that you see listed are things that the form has set up for you. You do not need to add them, and on the flip side of that, there is no deleting from them, which can be kind of annoying for some of our users, but as I said, this is optimized for intervention reviews. So this is my summary page, so you can see what I've done so far. It's a fairly populated form. Under identification, I have the study details that I can collect. So that's my sponsorship source, the country this was conducted in, the setting, whether it's maybe hospital, laboratory, home setting, etc., and any comments, as well as the author's contact details. This top part, the study details, this will export to the characteristics of included studies in RevMan 5. The next section is methods. Again, this whole section exports to the characteristics of included studies in RevMan 5. I have a drop-down where I can indicate my study design. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, so I can also select Other and enter any study design that I need to. There is the option to add custom text fields as well. So in this case, I wanted to know what the data collection period was, in addition to, of course, having automatically collected what the year of publication was on this study. I also wanted to know what their stated study aim was, just so that, especially once I export all of my information together, I can look at all of my included studies next to each other and have that data point ready to go and ready to compare from one study to the next. The next section is population. Again, all of this exports to the characteristics of included studies section in RevMan 5. So I might have my inclusion criteria. These I copied straight out of the PDF. My exclusion criteria, my pretreatment group differences, if any were noted. I believe in this case there weren't any noted. And then my baseline characteristics table. So this is sort of the first place I'll call out a little bit of a hack in using the system. So of course, this table is optimized to collect population baseline characteristics, such as the sample size, the gender makeup, the racial makeup, maybe educational population characteristics of the participants of a particular study that are usually reported. So in this case, age, BMI. This is also an excellent place to simply collect information on the study itself. Because these are free text fields, you can add additional characteristics. So I might even want to add my study aim here rather than having it under the methods section as a text box. So I could have a row that's called study aim, and I could collect information about the aim of this study. So I'd probably collect it in the overall box. And then again, once I export this, I have that in a table ready to go and ready for me to analyze or compare across all of my studies. The next section is my interventions tab, if you will. I have this particular review set up in a very generic way, and I did that in order to make sure that when I export to RevMan, all of the interventions are lumped into one big comparison. That was intentional. So anything that is given the same intervention name, when it goes into RevMan, will be put into the same comparison. So one pretty common thing that I see users do is that they will only add their interventions on a study-by-study basis. What that ends up meaning is that every study has a unique intervention name, which means that when they get to RevMan, they have, hundreds probably of comparisons of all the different combinations of all the different interventions that they have added across, an average of probably 30 to 40 studies, included studies in a systematic review. So my tip for that is to use generic names. So in this case, I've said intervention and placebo. You could do intervention and experimental. You could have a small number or relatively small number of generic names that, are something like high dose vitamins. This is a vitamin C for the common cold review. So I could have high dose vitamins versus low dose. But really the overall trick here is to make sure that you don't have a huge number of unique intervention names across your entire review to ensure that your comparisons of RevMan are the way you want them to be. Another common error because of the templating workflow, which is less than ideal, that we see is people maybe realize that they want to have these generic intervention names halfway through, and so they sort of backtrack and they start manually updating things. But you even saw just then, I had a lowercase l here, and then on another study, I might type with an uppercase L, and computers are smart, but they can be very dumb, and it would count those two things as two separate interventions and would not put them into the same comparison. In fact, it would probably put them into a comparison against each other, which results in a lot of manual work when you're exporting to RevMan. So again, mix these tips all together. So make sure you pilot, make sure you have your interventions set up at the beginning, and try to make sure that you have a minimal number of intervention names with generic, just only title them the way that you're going to set up your comparisons. And then use this table to collect the more nitty-gritty of the intervention information on a study-by-study basis. So this might be the dosage, co-treatment, delivery method, longest follow-up. I'm not a medical expert, so I'm having trouble thinking of any more intervention characteristics off the top of my head. But this would be the place, this table would be the place to collect more granular information on the unique intervention that has been tested in all of your included studies. So again, to reiterate, the goal here is to make sure that our comparisons in RevMan remain as clean as possible, but also that we collect all the information that we need to collect. And the way to do that is minimize the number of unique interventions and maximize use of the interventions characteristics table. Finally, my sort of last tip for extraction 1.0 and the common issues that we see is, again, keeping in theme with that piloting and making sure your template is set up as much as possible. So you can see here that I have two, I'm going to delete those interventions because now they're adding extra rows to everything. So as to keep everything clean. So back to my outcomes tab. You can see that I have two outcomes here that I did, in fact, collect information from this study. But I also have two other interventions that were not used in this study at all. But I have set these up on my template to make sure that they carry forward to all of my further extractions. So for one review that I worked on, for example, we had, I forget the exact number, it was high, it was like a few dozen possible outcomes that we had outlined in our protocol. That is a huge amount of setup, especially if you have to do it for every single one of your studies. 30 outcome tables across something like 70 included studies is a lot. I'm not going to do that math right now. So what I recommend is to have all of your possible outcomes that you plan to collect. So all the outcomes that are outlined in your protocol should all be set up on your template review study, regardless of whether they are reported in that study or not. So in this case, I just, again, set these up as an example. I have my adverse events, as well as duration of fever outcome. And these were not collected from this particular study, but by having them set up here, I ensure that when I reach a study that does have these events, that the formatting is identical, and that it's all clean to make sure that it exports to RevMan correctly. That's really the goal of all of these tips, is to make sure it looks in RevMan the way you want it to look. And on that note, my last hack of Extraction 1.0 is to use the time points as subgroups. So because of the way that they export to RevMan, what is called a time point, which is really just a set of columns. So if I add a time point, another one will be tacked on to the right. This would go into RevMan as a third subgroup. So in this case, I have my adverse events and I wanted to collect all of them. And then I also want to look at serious adverse events. So I have the option, I could set that up as two separate outcomes, but just in the interest of keeping my form as short as possible, I actually just wanted to do it this way and have them set up as subgroups instead. So that tip to summarize is to make use of the add a time point option to collect subgroup outcome information. And because of the way that Covidence links up with RevMan, it will actually set it up in a rather convenient way, which you can then work with.